speaking to you today here in early May, a breezy day at the moment in front of Brewer Library, and we have a show for you about natural resources. I've noticed they've made some changes here with the shrubbery around the Brewer Library. A little bit of change in nature, and nature is the subject of our show. We'll hear a Love of Learning lecture presented recently by Professor Scott Walter. It's entitled Getting Back to Center, Challenges Facing Natural Resources Policy.
On the back, there's some handouts from Ken Stark, who has it's called Stark's Environmental Cartoon Show. So he thought it was sort of apropos to what we're doing here tonight. And it's in the Viroqua, the McIntosh, I think it's called McIntosh Memorial Library in Viroqua. And it's only there till the 29th, but he has a lot of his cartoons up there. So there's a sheet about that if you'd like to look at that in the back. And welcome to our final Love of Learning lecture for the spring of 2023. I would like to announce that there probably will be many more Love of Learning lectures on the campus. Presently, we're in the midst of an agreement to have the campus be an educational cultural hub for advising those who wish to go to college and to have many enrichment courses on the campus for the community and the area industries. So that's where we're at. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Walter Scott. Dr. Scott Walter. A biology professor and a wildlife ecologist. He taught here from 1999 to 2010, and during that time he developed an environmental studies program which we sent several students to Stevens Point, and they have gone on to do wonderful things, and it was just a wonderful program here. Scott also worked a lot on the grouse, researching that, and on our own property that we owned out near Gotham, he developed an environment to have grouse grow or reproduce again. And I haven't been out there to hear that bump, but hopefully it's working. Anyway, we're very pleased to have Scott here. So tonight, Scott will talk about getting back to center, depolarizing Wisconsin's natural resources policies. Scott?
Thank you, Linda. It's nice to be here. Thanks for coming out on a Monday night. Maybe just a little note about where this talk came from. As Linda mentioned, I taught here for 10 or 11 years up until 2010. A job, looking back, I never should have left. It was the perfect balance in my life between work and home. Our family farm is just west of here, a handful of miles, but for a number of reasons I left and began a disgustingly dizzying array of job changes, many of which involved working for the Wisconsin DNR. And one of those, the large carnivore specialist position, had me in charge of the gray wolf, black bear, and cougar programs for the DNR, so I was involved in a lot of heady, science-driven, and contentious issues like how do we manage gray wolves in the state, how do we manage black bears. So one of the things I learned that even though my career trajectory started as a small-town Wisconsin farm kid, this interest in and passion for nature, right? I grew up spending my days out in the woods, out in the marshes, out in the fields, just fell in love with wildlife, and that propelled me into these different positions throughout my career. But what I learned as I took the reins of the large carnivore program worked for an NGO and was involved in some national conservation issues. What I really ended up enjoying was working with people. That's where I realized you can have the biggest impact on conservation efforts, and people are cool. Fundamentally, people are cool and nice to work with. So tonight's talk is sort of a repeat talk. When I had left that large carnivore position, I was still plugged into all the news articles on wolf management, and I was seeing how contentious things were remaining. And I just wrote a little commentary for a statewide newspaper. A friend of mine at Stevens Point, UW Stevens Point, read that, invited me to give a seminar up there, which I did a year or so ago. So this is kind of a repeat performance of that talk, but really what it deals with is, it's an appeal to the better parts of our human nature, I think. When we deal with contentious natural resource policy issues, when we deal, what is that?
It just got tired.
Oh,
You're going on too long. I asked you, you keep going.
all right. Well, what I'd like to talk about is essentially how we can get back to center and impart some common sense, some civility in discussions related to natural resource management or any other issue in society. I don't think I'd surprise anybody here if I said that things are so divided. And I'm not going to venture into the political realm, but I think some of the things I talk about in terms of my experiences with natural resource policy will allow you to draw very clear parallels with the way things run elsewhere. And maybe I'll start with a quick, whoop, do I need to sign in again?
Yeah, then it'll stick.
So that's my reminder not to talk too long, right?
Yeah, I can solve that.
But I'll start with a story that involves the greatest person I've ever known. You want to guess who that is?
Your mom?
Well, she's second, maybe. But no, my dad. So I was 18, and we were riding somewhere. It was a rainy night in the cab of Dad's old '68 Ford pickup that had a 2x4 under the passenger compartment holding the chassis onto the frame. And I had just turned 18, I was gonna vote for the first time. And I asked Dad, I didn't know anything about politics, I didn't know anything about anything at that point, really. And I asked Dad, I said, are we Democrats or Republicans? Because I'd heard people talking about such things. And Dad looked at me like I had two heads. And he said, last I checked, we were Americans. And to him, this political divide didn't exist, you know, and I guess I've carried that through my career when it comes to dealing with contentious or divisive issues. But at any rate, through all those jobs, I spent a lot of time talking with people about natural resource management. Spent a lot of time chairing committees, Wolf Management Committee, Black Bear Management Committee, Farm Bill Policy Committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I came out of many meetings, and you guys can probably relate to this, feeling like, wow, we knocked it out of the park. Everybody was sharing their thoughts. Everybody was listening. We made some great decisions. And I'd come out of other meetings thinking, what the hell happened? John couldn't shut up. Why was he getting so mad? He was pounding his fist on the table. We got nothing accomplished. So I started to think about communication and the way when you get a group of people together, you can most effectively move them toward consensus, which is always going to be in the middle, right? So the way natural resource policy works in Wisconsin is going to require us, I think, to do a hard reset and think about how we receive information and how we communicate information with others. But it's all based on two simple words, two things I think we're taught to cherish as children: trust and respect. It's been lost. It's sad to me. You can't hear a news story or read a newspaper article having to do with natural resources policy today without hearing about a lawsuit or some legal shenanigans that are driving policy setting. To me, it's just abhorrent that it's gotten to this point. Throughout my talk here, and I'm not gonna talk certainly longer than 3 hours. But throughout my talk, I'll use this wildlife species, the gray wolf, as sort of a case study, and I'll touch on some of my experiences there. But have you guys kept up over the last decade or so with what's happened with gray wolves in Wisconsin, listing, endangered species status, delisting, state management, on and on? Very divisive issues. Issues surrounding gray wolves. You have folks that would just as soon never see a hair on a wolf harmed. They're ecstatic that wolves are back in Wisconsin. They just as soon there were 10 times as many wolves everywhere in the state. And you've got people, carrying signs like wolves smoke a pack a day, that would just as soon there weren't a wolf left, and we should eradicate them all. Very contentious. And if I say these people are passionate, it's a big understatement. When I was in that role, their death threats were not uncommon. My predecessor in that role, when he went out to give public talks on wolves, he had to work with the Capitol Police and a federal law enforcement agency to establish a safety plan in case his safety were threatened. The state of Washington, as you see here, canceled all public meetings related to their developing wolf management plan because their staff were receiving death threats. And here are some of the nice ones they received. Kill the state officials. I can help. I have no arms, but I can shoot or use my hands. On and on and on. Where's the civility? Where's the adult-like discourse? People come at these issues with their minds already made up, fueled by whatever in their background leads them to that position. Quick question. What do these three things have in common? Fish, wildlife, navigable waters. This is kind of
Endangered?
Some are.
They need each other.
They need each other.
They're managed.
In terms of policy, they are managed. Who's responsible for their management? Who owns these things?
The public.
The public. The key is, and this is the fundamental dictum for the North American model of wildlife conservation, this is not true in most other countries. These things are held in the public trust, right? The public owns them. Therefore, the public is responsible for their management. So when we think about how we decide how to manage wolves in Wisconsin, or how important PFAS are in our groundwater tables, it's something everybody should have a say in, right? Because who is the public? Am I the public? Damn right. Are you? Members of the Humane Society? Yes. Members of Pheasants Forever, Ducks? Yes. It's yes across the board. Fundamental part of our management philosophy here in the United States, but something that makes management difficult because everybody has a stake in it, and of course everybody has a different point of view. All right, little art history. No. Anybody know who these two individuals are?
Socrates.
Almost. Socrates was one generation before these gentlemen.
Plato.
Plato on the left, Aristotle on the right. Let me give you a little background why I'm showing this. When I started teaching here, I was scared snotless because I was following in some legendary shoes, right? But I was handed this environmental science course to teach. And I wanted the students to engage in discussions on contentious environmental issues. Things like hunting, things like GMOs, things like pesticides, agriculture. And the first few times I tried that, it didn't go well. Students would get upset at something another student. They would yell. There were red faces and hard feelings. And I reflected on some readings I did when I was in college on some of the Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. When I was in college, I became enamored with the idea that these folks thought they could philosophize the function of blood in the human body. That through discussions, they could come to some great understanding about how the natural world operated. And what Plato and Aristotle here are doing is they're trying to understand the nature of truth, morals, ethics, values. In Plato, there is a point to this. We'll bring it around to wolves in a bit. You see, Aristotle's got his palm pointed downward, right, toward the ground. He espoused the universalist view of truth, morals, ethics, etc., and said that if I believe something's true, it's got to be true for everybody, right? Universalist point of view. Sorry, Plato with his finger pointed upward. Aristotle, on the other hand, espoused the view of relativism. Truth, morals, ethical guidelines are grounded in an individual's background, religious beliefs, family life, etc., etc. So there's room for discourse, right? My truth, my values, my understanding of the world might be different than somebody else's. Whereas a universalist, if everybody's supposed to believe the same thing, and that's the way I view my truth, there's really no room for discussion, right? So I asked my students, I said, given that as background, how do you approach discussions? Are you a universalist, where truth should be an absolute and held by everybody? Do you tend to say things like this? Well, this is obviously the only course of action, right? And if somebody presents data that counters that view, well, that data's got to be flawed. That's misinformation. Do we hear that in the news today all the time? And they're always wanting to interrupt. No, that's crazy. Don't let you get a word in edgewise, right? As Plato would say, that's a universalist point of view. Or are you an Aristotelian relativist? You tend to say things like this, having listened to you, I find that interesting. I can really understand why you hold that opinion, okay? Or, here's my opinion, what's yours? Very open to discussion, right? So which of these two views do you think best supports open discussion and consensus building? I think Aristotle had it right. My students responded to this, and when they would act up, start to get angry in class, I would say, hey John, channel your Aristotle a little bit more. And, oh yeah, right. Leaves the door open for other points of view. The easiest way I can sum up my key point tonight, like every secret to life, Dr. Seuss, right? Who read the Sneetches as a kid, right? Sneetches, critters alike in all ways, except some had a star in their belly and some did not. And based on that single little difference, Sneetch society imploded, right? This is how we act. We read this book when we were 5 years old, and we said, oh yeah, we're really all the same. And then a couple decades later, we act like complete jerks when we're put in a room with folks that might view things a little differently than we do. If you understand the central tenet behind Dr. Seuss's The Sneetches, we're done. I can wrap her up right now, but I won't. There's some problems we run into when we try to engage in natural resource policy, when we try to engage in political discussions, whatever social issue we might be discussing. The biggest one, I think, is the herd mentality, okay? If I have a view that, or an opinion that I hold to very strongly, who am I gonna tend to hang out with? Only others that share that view. Especially if I'm a universalist. Folks who don't share that view piss me off. And I don't wanna be around them. But when we insulate ourselves only with others that share that view, we become nothing but a member of a flock, right? We, in a very fundamental sense, I think, lose our individuality. We lose those things in our background, our knowledge, our training, that allow us to really provide insight and input on discussions. So people get lazy. They simply adopt that group's positions. In politics, I think this is rampant. Red sign or blue sign in your front yard, that labels you across the board as a member of a group. And as a member of that group, we look across the fence at members of other groups and we start throwing stones, right? We objectify, simplify other groups' views, and spend our time trying to tear their arguments, tear their beliefs down, okay? This inevitably polarizes discussions. We've got people on two sides of the fence, respect is lost, trust is lost, and there's simply no middle ground. Nobody's listening, everybody's just shouting across that fence. And I think we're almost pre-programmed to this. Think of yourselves in middle school. You go through the lunch line, you got a tray of food, then you turn, and for me, I was a painfully shy young man, comfortable in the woods, not comfortable around people at all. But you turn with you're all alone, and there's all these people. Who do you inevitably go sit by? If you have a football jersey on, you go sit with the other football players. If you have your cheerleading outfit, there's the cheerleaders, there's my group. It's almost like we're programmed from a young age to gravitate toward the group that shares, and there's good reasons for that. Same enthusiasm, same beliefs, laugh at the same jokes, tell the same stories, right? But I think fundamentally that feeds itself into this herd mentality, polarization, conflict. And in the natural resource arena, we see this commonly. We see labels applied. We see folks positioning themselves on one side of the fence as a hunter, say, and ridiculing members on the other side who are espousing anti-hunter views. And they yell nasty things at each other, tree hugger, granola cruncher, bleeding heart, whatever, with similar nasty things coming back at them from the other side. And when I, as the chair of the Black Bear Management Committee, Wolf Committee, whatever, would sit at a table, I would see these predispositions, these inherent tendencies come forward for members of the committee all the time. And it would remind me of what? This. It's the same thing. When we look at those two individuals, I see two people passionate about nature. They share so much. And when we think about the dangers, the challenges we face in trying to conserve the natural world, wouldn't it be better if we worked together, put our knowledge and energy and dollars behind conservation that addresses the real threats out there, habitat loss, climate change, on and on and on. Okay? But no, we keep acting like Sneetches. So let me tell you a quick story. One of the coolest meetings I ever attended that I almost wasn't given permission to attend. So I was in the large carnivore position. I'm in charge again of the state's gray wolf population. And it's contentious. I mean, when my phone rang down in my office in Madison, I literally would go like this, oh, who's mad now? One day I'd get a call from the head of Midwest Environmental Advocates or the Humane Society screaming at me for something the DNR had done. The next day I'd get a phone call from some hunting group screaming at me for something the DNR hadn't done. And it was just a thankless, no-win job. But at any rate, I got a call one day from the Wisconsin Farm Bureau. And they said, hey Scott, DNR's dropping the ball on this wolf thing. We've got all these farmers up in Taylor County, the local wolf packs have killed X number of calves, they're chasing cows through fences, these farmers are upset. They've scheduled a meeting in Medford, could you come up and meet with us? And my inclination was sure, but by that point I understood that as a DNR employee I needed permission to do anything, so I asked for permission, and it probably took me 2 weeks to get the green light to go sit and talk with these people. There's all this hand wringing, right? Oh my gosh, what's Scott gonna say? How upset are these people? And it got to the point where they said, you can go, but we want 3 wardens, armed wardens, in the room with you, in case things go off the track. And I said, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to go in, ready for battle. I want to walk in and listen, right? Doesn't that seem simple? I say, I've thrown a few hay bales in my life. I've milked piles of cows. I think I can relate to these individuals as people, right? Well, we don't know if that's a good idea. What if? And finally, I got permission to go. So I drove up to Medford and walked in to this building, a conference room a little bit bigger than this, and they sat me at one end of a table, went around the room, and I sat there on this end by myself, and there were, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 farmers lining the other sides of the table. And they started the meeting by, and this was really informative for me, going around the room and telling me in very clear terms what effect wolves had had on their farming operations. They lost cows, they lost beef cattle, they lost calves, injured animals, cows being chased through fences. Really impactful stuff, right? You're hearing it from the farmers who are feeling the pressure from this burgeoning Wisconsin wolf population. And I will tell you that maybe they took a little bit of skin off the DNR guy who had showed up to feed their animosity. But the cool part of this, after the meeting was over, the formal part of the meeting, I had an opportunity just to grab a cookie and a soda and walk around the room and talk to these folks. And I ended up talking to a guy named Ryan. He and his wife were raising their 4 kids on a multi-generational dairy farm just east of Medford, trying to, think about getting their kids to college, trying to make a living in a very, very hard field, the dairying business. And Ryan, when they had gone around the room, was upset. They had faced impacts to the tune of about $30,000 a year at the hands of their local wolf pack. But when Ryan and I were standing next to each other, sort of person to person, what did we talk about? I said, how old are your kids? Oh, I've got a daughter that age. What's she into? And pretty soon we're laughing. And at the end of the conversation, Ryan turned to me and said, Scott, I'm sorry I was hard on you earlier, but dang it, we got to do something. The DNR is not providing us any support in terms of the challenges we face with these wolves. And he said, and this is what I thought was really cool. He said, I got to tell you, I kind of like having wolves around. He said, it's so cool hearing those howls on the back recess of our farm. My daughter wrote a report in school on wolves, and I've got it on the refrigerator. I learned a ton. She was really into these wolves. But we tend to take people like Ryan and label them as anti-wolf because they're farmers. He's just a guy, right? Trying to make a living. And when we talk to each other with trust and respect, there was common ground there. I was able to share some thoughts from my position with the DNR that hopefully you found meaningful, and we were engaging. When I left that job, I really thought the path toward effective wolf management in the state was paved in gold, as long as people could keep talking. Of course, that always hasn't been the case. When we look broadly at the conservation field, we see incredible similarities in terms of goals, aspirations. These are the quotes from the mission statements of a couple prominent conservation organizations, promoting wildlife conservation worldwide. And then the second, we work to secure a future for all species, great and small. Same thing, right? These groups have an identical mission, identical goals that I think we can all support. The groups are the Safari Club International and the Center for Biological Diversity. They differ maybe in their emphases. Safari Club International, of course, largely populated by hunter members. Center for Biological Diversity, more preservation-minded, but their missions are identical, right? One issue pops up though, and these individuals with identical missions run to opposite sides of the spectrum. And that issue is wolf management. They took different stances on wolf management. Their relationship and the relationship between many other similar conservation organizations fractured immediately. No more productive discourse. This single divisive issue has dominated what these groups have done for easily the last decade. And I think this is often, sadly, how natural resource policy development operates. You guys remember in grade school doing this little experiment? You sprinkle pepper on water, and you take a drop of soap, and the pepper flakes scatter. That soap is a policy issue. And groups polarize immediately to opposite sides of the spectrum. Where's the middle? Nobody's in the middle. Nobody's talking about issues that would get them toward the middle. They stop talking. And instead their relationship is played out in the media, social media, and in the legal system. They file lawsuits, they beat each other up on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and natural resource policy is the product of these types of shenanigans instead of open, trustful, respectful discourse between the groups themselves, remembering that their fundamental missions are identical, right? This stuff is bad enough. To see what conservationists say about other conservationists is disheartening enough, but seeing what happens in the legal system as these groups attack each other is even more, I think, repugnant. Who's heard of the Equal Access to Justice Act? This is a little twist on this issue that a lot of folks aren't aware of, but it was an act passed, 30 years ago, and it was designed to allow individual citizens and groups legal recourse if they're injured or harmed by some action of the federal government. Taxpayers will foot their legal expenses to keep the federal government from stepping with a heavy foot on the individual. So if you're harmed by the federal government, you've got this behind you. You can sue the government. Wealthy companies are excluded from this, but here's the key, nonprofits are not. There are a lot of nonprofits out there, and Just sit back and think of the conservation groups you might belong to, who can sue the government willy-nilly, just for fun, without ever paying a penny. They'll send you mailers. Help us save gray wolves. The evil Wisconsin DNR is thinking about a hunting season for gray wolves. Send us $100 and you'll help us. They don't even need that money because those lawsuits to them are free. An example, Center for Biological Diversity. Their net assets a few years ago, $22 million. On their list of staff members, they had 46 individual attorneys listed. In just a few year period, they were recorded as filing 549 individual lawsuits. Their co-founder, Karen Suckling, made this statement about how their group utilizes the legal system simply to put pressure on scientists and natural resource agencies to get what they want. We use lawsuits to help shift the balance of power. New injunctions, new species listings, and new bad press take a terrible toll on agency morale. And he's priding himself in this, using lawsuits to gum up the conservation system. Psychological warfare is a very underappreciated aspect of environmental campaigning. Between October 2009 and mid-2012, 489 cases were filed by environmental groups. So those 183 cases were awarded judgment totaling $52 million of taxpayers' money. These nonprofit groups, NGOs, file lawsuits at no expense to themselves. The bill falls at the taxpayers' feet, and they gum up the system. This is interesting as well. Those agencies, the Wisconsin DNR, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, on and on and on, when there's a lawsuit filed, they have to prove discovery, right? They've got to provide documents. They've got to spend scads of staff time providing the information required in the litigation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff estimate that for every dollar awarded as litigant attorney fees, the agency cost is $5. This is a gentleman I've met a couple times over the years, Chris Servine. He was hired to help restore the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear population, which now is doing relatively well. But he was in that role for about 30 years. This was very effective. Allowed that bear population, by applying science and being able to put boots on the ground, to increase. Okay? Servine said that he spent no time on legal issues in his first 26 years in that post. However, once the Equal Access to Justice Act was passed and natural resource policy began to be played out in courtrooms, he estimates that he spent up to 40% of his time afterwards helping government lawyers answer legal challenges. It's almost like the grizzly bears no longer matter, right? The work he'd done early in his career helped this endangered species to increase, but thereafter he's just responding to these, in many cases, really frivolous lawsuits used by NGOs. In some cases, I would say cynically, as a fundraising mechanism, right? You've all gotten those mailers in the mail. They're very appealing. We have great examples to follow. If we want to move back toward the middle and engage in trusting and respectful discussions, these individuals provide a great example. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, is in both photographs. Who are the other two individuals? Who's this? Native Wisconsinite, John Muir, right? Give it up for John. Who's this? Gifford Pinchot, the first director of the U.S. Forest Service. Teddy Roosevelt had at his disposal something called the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. You ever wonder where all our national forests, national parks, wilderness areas came from? It was Teddy Roosevelt and a couple presidents just before him, though he was the most active with this, that using the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, he basically could ride across the western plains and mountains, see a beautiful stretch of mountains and say, all right, that's mine. That's now the federal government's. Through that piece of legislation, they locked up about 140 million acres of federal government lands. That's now our national forests, BLM lands, national parks, et cetera, et cetera. And the distinction between national forests, where we can cut timber, extract minerals, et cetera, and our national parks, where we can't, arose because of the very different views that Pinchot and Muir were pushing Roosevelt for. Muir said, we've got to set these lands aside. We have already screwed up so much in this nation that these last remaining pieces of pristine wilderness, hands off. Don't put roads in there, no timber cutting, no mineral extraction. He espoused the preservation ideals. Pinchot, on the other hand, said that, John, my friend, is nuts. We've got towns to build. We've got railroads to build. We need those natural resources. Pinchot advocated for sustainable use, but he said we've got to use the resources at our disposal to allow this country to grow. Eventually that became known as the conservation movement, right? So preservation versus conservation. And these two are largely portrayed as antagonists as a result of those different views, very different views, that they held. On an issue, I would contend, of far greater importance than how we manage wolves in Wisconsin. We're talking about 140 million acres of land and how it's managed. Their views diametrically opposed to one another. So historically, their relationship is often viewed as contentious. But here's the thing. They were actually good buddies. They were friends. They maintained throughout their lives correspondence. And the correspondence reflected a deep appreciation for one another as individuals. Here's a telegram sent by Gifford Pinchot to Muir. Many thanks. Now, how are the wife and kids? Great seeing you last month at the meeting. Hope you're well. Kiss, kiss. These two individuals disagreed, but they not only respected, they liked one another. In today's world, can you even fathom that? It's hard to believe, but there's a great story of Pinchot and Muir when they were together at some meeting. I think it was in the desert Southwest. They disappeared. Nobody knew where they were. Just gone. All these high rollers from the federal government supposed to be at these meetings. Muir and Pinchot disappeared. They showed up the next day at breakfast. They walked in arm in arm, giggling. It was described like schoolboys. They disappeared for a night on the town together. Even though their opinions were so different on this massive conservation issue. Just mention, if you're interested in that sort of conservation history, this book came out just a couple of years ago, Natural Rivals by John Clayton, and it talks about their relationship. But if they can do it, why can't we? They could argue, discuss, debate all day long, and still have respect for one another. Something that, for whatever reason, seems to have been lost. So the way conservation plays out, policy development, it's always in meetings like this. Natural Resource Board meetings, Wolf Management Committee meetings, Farm Bureau meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And around the table, I just grabbed some logos here, but a whole bunch of groups, each of which has some investment in the topic being discussed. So they send representatives, those representatives sit around the table, look at the information, and they're supposed to then take that information back to their groups, right? Inform them on the science behind the topic they've been discussing. Share views may be expressed at the meeting by other groups, and move everybody towards some sort of consensus on the issue. But it's not the way these things tend to work. What happens, yep, fun with PowerPoint. What happens, and I've seen it play out this way more than once. Groups with similar opinions, with similar ideas about what the desired course of action is, align with other groups that agree with them. And they fight in opposition to the groups that don't. And it becomes just like the two herds of sheep staring across the fence. And it gets so childish that if one set of groups finds themselves lacking in numbers, they will petition the Secretary of the DNR or the Governor for the addition of another group who they know will agree with them, right? Leaving this middle ground sort of vacant. What's wrong with us? All right, I want to mention the role of non-governmental organizations or nonprofits. They are very important in conservation efforts. They have legislative liaisons. They work on Capitol Hill. They're in the state capitol all the time. So folks like SCI, Center for Biological Diversity, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, the Sierra Club, all these NGOs are out there. And one point I want to make, they rely upon their members for funding. They are businesses, right? And we'll look at a couple here. Some of these groups, I would argue, have a very real impact on conservation because their mission is science-based and it's about addressing real conservation issues, right? Like Pheasants Forever, Grassland Conservation, Ducks Unlimited, Wetland Conservation. They make a simple claim, habitat's being lost, here's the data, and here's what we're gonna do with your donations to address it, okay? But they are businesses. And it's big business when you get to the level of these groups. Like Ducks Unlimited, their CEO is compensated at over $500,000 a year. They've got net assets, nearly a third of $1 billion, okay? But it all starts with the individual members. The herd mentality can strike here as well, right? If you become a member of these or any other groups, you get the magazine, you read the articles, you can lose your individuality and sort of melt in to that group very easily. What's popping up more and more though, I see are, and I'll use air quotes here, conservation groups that have no real clear mission. They're just grabbing on to an angry group of individuals, jumping in the forefront, trying to band them together and lead them for money, okay? And I won't name any, although a number are running through my head. They say, in my mind, crazy things like this. We'll fight for you, hunters, farmers, wilderness advocates, landowners, whatever. And I've actually heard these. And your right to praise God, and your rights as Americans. What? For $30 a year, you're gonna do all that? Give us money and we'll fight like hell. These groups are common now. They're at the table in these committee rooms, board rooms, trying to hammer out natural resource policy. but their missions to me aren't really the same as others. There's something else weird that's going on, has been going on for quite a while. And I coined this, but celebrityizing conservation. Two photos there. Anybody recognize either of those gentlemen? No? Let me give you a couple of hints. The guy in the top wrote a rockin' 70s power guitar song, Cat Scratch Fever. John, I can't tell you how many cans of Old Milwaukee I pounded in my dorm room in college while headbanging to Cat Scratch Fever, right? This guy in the bottom here, all he did was develop a patch occupancy modeling approach to estimating gray wolf numbers in Wisconsin so that we could effectively manage the species as it increased. Guy in the top has an awesome nickname, Motor City Madman, right? Guy in the bottom, all he did, he developed a population estimator for bobcats in Wisconsin, for the first time allowing us to determine how many bobcats were on the landscape so they could be managed appropriately. Guy in the top, if you missed this episode of Miami Vice, he once played a drug dealer, and he did it very well, very convincing drug dealer. Guy in the bottom, all he did, gained some national exposure for this. He developed a genetic-based capture mark recapture estimator for black bears in Wisconsin. So for the first time, we had a really accurate picture of how many black bears were in the state so we could balance harvest with population growth to achieve a healthy bear population. Of these two, on issues related to fur bear management in Wisconsin, who do you think we should be listening to?
Ted Nugent.
Ted Nugent is the guy in the top. The guy in the bottom, Nathan Roberts. Got to work with Nathan very closely. Brilliant guy, in a handful of years with the Wisconsin DNR, did all these wonderful things, and many more. But you guys have never heard of him. But you have heard of this guy. He is all over the place now in wildlife. Well, I shouldn't say wildlife, in wildlife. Groups will hire him to rally the troops, to get out there in front of this group of pissed off hunters and tell them what the DNR's got to do, right? Why? I don't really feel the need to hear Ted Nugent's, I don't feel the need to hear Nathan Roberts sing Cat Scratch Fever. Why should I feel the need to listen to Ted Nugent's views on wolf management in Wisconsin? But he is everywhere in the conservation world. He's got a loud voice and people follow him. He's on boards. He's testifying in front of governmental bodies because he wrote Cat Scratch Fever. I don't get it. But that's the way conservation works, or doesn't work. Shouldn't this be the linchpin that ties these groups together? When they walk into that meeting, shouldn't science be the first thing they talk about? Review the latest population estimates. Talk about impacts of this strategy versus that strategy. Because I'll tell you, the science is there and it's strong. With respect to wolves, if you want to ever get totally confused and develop an incredible amount of respect for somebody's quantitative skills, talk to Jennifer Stenglein with the Wisconsin DNR. She is an incredibly skilled quantitative ecologist. When Jennifer tells me how many wolves there are in the state, I go, okay, I'm with you, because you're really smart. Science such as that coming from Jennifer's desk, should be what leads these discussions. But it can only do so if three things are true. First of all, we've got to understand it. The population models developed to drive conservation discussions related to a lot of wildlife species, they're complex. Patch occupancy modeling approaches, mixed modeling, it's complex stuff. There's probably a handful of people in the state that are really well-versed in quantitative matters to understand it, and I'm not always in that group. But we have to understand it. One of the big shortcomings, I think, of science in general is its still inability to communicate the results of that science effectively to the public. So we got to understand it. Maybe as importantly, we've got to let it inform our views, right? If it doesn't agree with our predispositions, our attitudes, our beliefs, we can't therefore cast it aside and view it as a threat to our already established views with regards to black bear management, wolf management, PFAS effects, whatever. So we've got to allow it in, and we have to trust it. Okay? There's that word, trust, again. In society broadly, do you think that these three things are true? Maybe I should ask that differently. In society broadly, do you think any of these are true? How do we get there? So with that as background, related again to the Wisconsin wolf issue, the chair of our Natural Resources Board, the body charged with developing natural resource policy in the state of Wisconsin, had this comment just a year ago. Kaz said, nobody believes the DNR's wolf population estimates. I don't know exactly where Kaz was coming from, where Greg was coming from with that. But if he's right, we've already lost, right? What one fundamental piece of information do you need to manage any population? How many there are? If we don't know that, we can't manage wolves, bears, anything in the state. Okay? So I hope he's wrong. I certainly believe those estimates, understanding that a big part of science is uncertainty. Give me an estimate, they will also tell you how confident they are in that estimate. You've got to accept that as well. All right, there's a fancy little philosophical statement there about healthy discussions. This is what divisiveness and discord have led to with Wisconsin's wolf population. This slide, as I was playing in PowerPoint, making little colors and stuff, drove me nuts. What you see here is the trend over the last 40 years in the number of wolves in Wisconsin, unless you believe Kaz, and these numbers are meaningless. It trends in the number of wolves, the number of wolf packs going up and up and up. The colors relate to the different legal status of wolves as it's changed through time. Wolves have been placed on the endangered species list and then taken off the endangered species list, I think 8 times now. So, endangered, threatened, endangered, off the list, endangered, off the list, endangered, off the list, endangered. And I didn't update this. They were taken off the list briefly about 1.5 years ago and then put right back on. Okay? Even though wolves have gone like this, even though the recovery goal was here, state population goal at the time, 350. Why people refusing to seek consensus? Polarized groups, filing lawsuits to relist wolves, delist wolves, regardless of what the science says. And here's the upshot, just my take with respect to wolves. It's become a legal issue, it's become a political issue, yet there are still the Ryans out there on the landscape feeling the impacts of these wolves and simply asking the government, they don't want to break the law. These are good people, right? But over the course of decades, the state has not been able to provide them a full suite of management options because of the federal endangered status. At some point, public tolerance of wolves is going to swing strongly the other way, and folks are going to take matters in their own hands. That's probably happening a lot already. So I would say our inability to achieve consensus is not good for wolves either. Okay? So how do we get back to center? Let's wrap all that nonsense up. How do we get back to some positive, adult-like, respectful, trusting discourse on natural resource issues or any other issues in society? Listen. I mean, I remember this tall, my mom pointing at me in the face saying, listen! I guess I listened because maybe I'm just so afraid of my mom. But I enjoy people. I like being in rooms with all these groups. I enjoy this. I don't have a problem listening. Because when you listen, you learn. It's just simple respect, right? But always think for yourself. I don't like being labeled, right? In the political realm, it's kind of are you Democrat or Republican? I always say neither, I vote for the person I think is going to do the best job, right? I don't like those types of labels, because once you label yourself, you're a sheep in that herd, right? It's very easy to lose your individual voice, so avoid that herd mentality. Do your best to understand the science as it's presented, and allow it to inform your views. Share that science with others. And here's the big one. Think of everything we have in common. Ryan, guy he and his wife Sherry, making their living as farmers. Don't label them as anti-wolf farmers. They like wolves. But there's got to be some middle ground in terms of how that wolf population is managed, or they won't like them forever. Okay. We always have to remember this. If we're passionate about natural resources, we're somewhat unique. Most people don't. Most people don't care a whit about Kirtland's warblers. Most people don't care a whit about gray wolves. Why are we dividing individuals that do? We really got to get back to common ground. Okay. All right, this is my wrap-up slide. The Sneetches figured it out. The end of that book, as you'll remember, the star didn't matter. They realized they were all here for the same purpose, and they could smile and hold hands, whether or not they had a star in their belly. Maybe at some point, we'll get around to this understanding ourselves as a society, and we'll find common ground on the wolf issue and so many others that plague us. But I doubt it.
Well, thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that awards presentations will be made at our UW Richland campus on Friday evening, and on Saturday, starting at 2 p.m., the students are holding a festival for people in the community. We hope you'll come back next week and every week to watch our town.